Right, we now come to the statement. Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will make a statement on capacity in the Crown Court. When this government took office 8 months ago, we received an inheritance from those opposite that was little short of disgraceful. Our prisons were in crisis, on the edge of collapse, and our courts faced a record and rising backlog. While the crisis in our prisons was more obvious and visible, the harm caused by the backlog in our courts cannot be overestimated. Today, the backlog stands at over 73,000 cases. Just 5 years earlier, it had been half of that figure. We should stop and consider that fact, because the backlog is far more than a number. Behind each case is a victim. Many have waited years for justice, and some will now not have their cases heard until 2028. With delays this long, it is little wonder that more victims are dropping out. And tragically, this is true of victims of the most heinous crimes. Just 5 years ago, around 3% of adult rape victims whose cases were due to go to trial dropped out before their case was heard. Today, that figure has more than doubled. Mr. Speaker, an old adage has sadly come true in this country. For far too many, justice delayed is justice denied. Unlike our predecessors who allowed this backlog to rise and rise, this government will bear down on it. We will deliver swifter justice for the victims of crime, and that starts today with a record investment in our criminal courts. Mr. Speaker, each financial year the government determines the total number of days that can be sat across all our courts and tribunals, commonly referred to as sitting days. This process is called the Concordat, and last year I committed to concluding the process earlier than in previous years to give our courts greater certainty. We have now done so several months ahead of last year's settlement. And so today, I can announce that this government will provide a total budget of £2.5 billion for our courts and tribunals in the next financial year. Mr. Speaker, this represents a record level of investment. It will fund up to 110,000 sitting days in our Crown Courts. This is 4,000 more days than the previous government funded last year. And if the Shadow Minister opposite would like to check the record books, he will find no higher allocation in recorded history. Beyond the Crown Court, investment in the family and civil courts brings those jurisdictions at or close to their maximum capacity. And this investment in court capacity is matched by an investment in court maintenance. Our courts have been allowed to fall into a shocking state of disrepair in recent years. And so this government will boost funding to £148.5 million, up from £128 million last year. This will be the highest figure spent on maintenance and capital works in the last 10 years. Mr. Speaker, this builds on a consistent theme of this new government and a marked difference when compared to our predecessors. In our first 8 months in office, we have consistently invested more in the courts than the last Conservative government. On entering office, I immediately funded 500 sitting days on top of the allocation provided by the previous Lord Chancellor. At the end of last year, when resources allowed, I added a further 2,000. In October, this government also increased magistrates' court sentencing powers. Previously, they could only impose a 6-month prison sentence, and we lifted this to 12 months. In doing so, we freed up capacity in the Crown Court to hear the most serious cases. This single change was equivalent to adding another 2,000 sitting days in our Crown Courts. Mr. Speaker, all these changes are necessary for the swift delivery of justice. However, I must be honest in a way that my predecessors never were. This investment is necessary but not sufficient to reduce the Crown Court backlog. Even with record levels of funding, if we do not take other bolder measures, the backlog will grow. With a growing number of cases entering our courts and with cases of increasing complexity being heard in front of our judges, we cannot simply do more of the same. We must do things differently. So in December, I appointed Sir Brian Leveson, one of our most distinguished judges, to conduct a wholesale review of our criminal courts. The review will propose long-term reform, as well as reviewing the efficiency and timeliness of court processes from charge all the way to case completion. But crucially, I've also asked him to address something that too many others have avoided, the question of structural reform. Today, 10% of criminal cases are heard in a Crown Court, where a judge presides and a jury decides. Mr. Speaker, jury trials are a pillar of our justice system for the most serious offences, and that will never change. However, we must ask ourselves whether there are cases that we are hearing today that could be handled equally well elsewhere. There are already some cases that can be heard in either a Crown or a Magistrates' Court. We call these trialable either-way cases. Today, they represent 40% of the court's backlog. But while a conviction, whether determined by a jury or a magistrate, is the same, regardless of the type of courtroom, the demand that they place on our justice system is very different indeed. An either-way case is resolved by magistrates 5 times faster than before a judge and jury. Now, justice must be done. Criminals must always face consequences. On that, I know this House will agree. But we must be willing to ask whether a judge and jury should be occupied at great length and expense on crimes that could be dealt with more swiftly elsewhere. For that reason, I've asked Sir Brian to consider the case for reclassifying some less serious offences, whether magistrate sentencing powers are sufficient, and the case for a new court to sit between the magistrates and the Crown. Sir Brian's recommendations will come later this spring. His goal and mine are one: to bear down on the backlog and deliver swifter justice for victims. The consequences of failing to do so are all too clear. The backlog in the criminal courts will rise. Cases will be listed even further into the future. More victims of crime will decide the wait is too painful with justice so distant, and as a result, dangerous criminals will walk free. So today we've announced a record investment in our courts. 110,000 sitting days funded, 4,000 more than the previous administration. For many victims, their case will be heard sooner. But if we are to deliver swifter justice for all, we must embrace reform too. This government will deliver once-in-a-generation reform of our courts. We will reverse the decline and the delays of the last Conservative government, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. I can always help by reopening Chorley Court for you. Right, let us come to this young Lord Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's great to see the Justice Secretary back in the country after her holiday in Texas. If she can find time to travel to America, why can't she find time to travel to the 2 Category A prisons that the independent... well, I'd be pleased to hear from the Right Honourable Lady that's the case. That wasn't the answer to our written parliamentary question the other day. But, Mr. Speaker, today, the Central Criminal Court has 13 courtrooms sat empty. In Preston, 40% of courtrooms sit empty. In Winchester, it's 2/3. And as a result of the court backlog, that has grown under the Justice Secretary. We need to be maximising court capacity, taking full advantage of all available days, and probing the judiciary for options to create more capacity. I know that. I'd like to believe that the Right Honourable Lady knows that. But how did we get here? Well, we got here because... We got here because, just like every other area of this Labour government, it came to office with no plan whatsoever. And it has wasted its first 8 months in office. Upon entering office, the Lady Chief Justice informed the Justice Secretary there were at least 6,500 sitting days available to address the court backlog. The Lord Chancellor responded by adding a measly 500 sitting days. The court backlog kept growing. So frustrated was the Lady Chief Justice that she came to Parliament in November and took the unusual step of publicly chastising the Justice Secretary, and she reiterated her offer of 6,500 sitting days. The Justice Secretary responded a month later by adding 2,000 sitting days. The court backlog kept growing. And here we are, again, 8 months on from the Justice Secretary taking office on the very day that the Public Accounts Committee published an excoriating report into her department to promise more sitting days. So, Mr. Speaker, is it third time lucky for the Justice Secretary? No. What we've learnt again today is that the Justice Secretary is still turning down available sitting days. And astonishingly, she has conceded that the court backlog will keep on rising. This is simply not acceptable. So, of course, I welcome the changes made by the Justice Secretary, but it is not enough. She says that victims will get quicker justice. Well, tell that to the victims of rape who are having their court cases listed for 2028.
Order. Please, I need to be able to hear it. When you shout, when the front bench is shouting so long I can't hear, I'll decide whether it's in order or not. Are we understanding each other? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't pretend that cutting the court backlog is easy or that it will be quick, but the Secretary of State owes the country a plan and a timetable for when the backlog is actually going to fall. This morning, she was repeatedly asked, but refused to give an answer. So can she tell the country now? When will the court backlog begin to fall? By what date does her department forecast it falling? And why will she not take up the 2,500 additional sitting days offered time and time again by the Lady Chief Justice? And lastly, turning to the new sentencing guidelines that's been published alongside this statement, which will make a custodial sentence less likely for, and I quote, ethnic minorities, cultural minorities and faith minority communities. Why is the Justice Secretary enshrining this double standard, this two-tier approach to sentencing? This is an inversion of the rule of law. We on this side of the House believe in equality under the law. Why doesn't she?
So state.
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State asked the question, how did we get here? I'll tell him how we got here. His administration and the 14 years they had in power and the absolute mess they made of the criminal justice system, a mess that this government is clearing up. I'm sorry to deprive him of what I'm sure he thought was a clever attack line on my recent visit to Texas. I can inform him I have in fact visited Manchester Prison. I did so during the February recess and...
Please. I did say to the other side, I do need to hear, so please.
And he should welcome us seeking to learn from a tough law and order state in America where they had the same problems that we inherited from his administration 20 years ago, and where they've embarked on criminal justice reform that has seen levels of reoffending a low level that we could only dream of thus far in this country. So he should seek to learn from other countries as we are doing. If his government had done so when they were in power, we wouldn't have such a big mess to clear up in the criminal justice system. He refers to courtrooms sitting empty. One of the reasons why so many of those courtrooms have been sitting empty is because his government, one of their last acts on leaving office, was to only fund 106,000 sitting days. I have lifted that amount. Today is a record number of Crown Court sitting days, the highest ever that will be funded by this Labour government. So more of those courtrooms are, of course, going to be put to use. He will also know that in order to run the system efficiently, there will always be some courtrooms not in use so that they can cope with the influxes of demand. That is the normal practice for how we run. But more courtrooms, as a result of this decision today, will be in use than was ever the case under his administration. He asks me what I have been doing and what is the plan. Well, let me tell him. When I first came into office, the first thing I did was increase the number of sitting days by 500. His government left office at 106,000. I increased it immediately. I then made a further allocation and increased again by another 2,000 before Christmas, making progress on dealing with the Crown Court's backlog and picking up the pieces of the mess that his government left behind. He'll know that the changes I made to magistrates' court sentences sentencing powers, also have freed up capacity in the Crown Courts. And we have increased funding for legal aid, criminal legal aid, by 92 million so that we have the money to underpin the system. That is action. That is an increase in sitting days in year and an unprecedented increase in sitting days for the next year. That's what this Labour government is delivering. And he will also know that even if we were sitting at the maximum judicial capacity, which he's right to refer to, the Lady Chief Justice has referenced in Parliament herself, even at maximum judicial capacity, that backlog is still going to rise. And that is because the demand coming into the system is fast outstripping the pace at which cases are being disposed of. And so knowing that, it would be unconscionable if I stood before this House and behaved as if resources alone were going to fix the problem. That is why Sir Brian Leveson is considering once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts. It's the combination of the steps I've already taken, the funding I've now allocated, and the review that will lead to once-in-a-generation reform. That's what a plan looks like to fix the mess his government left behind. It's a plan that they could have done when they were in government. They failed to do so, and now they carp from the sidelines when somebody else is actually getting on with the job. And then let me just say finally, as somebody who's of an ethnic minority background myself, I do not stand for any differential treatment before the law for anyone of any kind, and there will never be a two-tier sentencing approach under my watch or under this Labour government.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Mr Speaker, can I congratulate the Lord Chancellor on the figures she's announced and on starting to get to grips with her baleful inheritance, but there's a long way to go. The Lady Chief Justice told the Lords Constitution Committee last week that she was pressing for Crown Courts to sit to capacity. Does the 110,000 figure represent capacity? If not, what is capacity? And given the backlog is 73,000 cases and rising, will she guarantee sitting days up to capacity for the whole of the coming year? In her statement, she rightly promises investment in the family and civil courts to bring those jurisdictions at or close to maximum capacity. Will she make the same commitment for the Crown Court?
Well, he will know that there is a difference between the system capacity and what is termed maximum judicial capacity. He is right. The Lady Chief Justice has said that the maximum judicial capacity is 113,000 sitting days in the Crown. We are funding 110,000 sitting days in the Crown. That is because I, in my role as Lord Chancellor, have to be mindful of the wider system capacity that can be managed. That is to say, the availability not just of the judges to sit in the Crown Court, but also the lawyers, the prosecutors, the availability of legal aid and the defence barristers that underpin the rest of the system as well. I am confident that the 110,000 sitting days represents the system capacity, and that is what is being delivered.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Josh Babarinde.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tens of thousands of victims and survivors waiting for their day in court is one of the darkest legacies of the last Conservative government. I sincerely feel this because under that Conservative government, I was one of those victims. After 2 decades of agonising over whether to report my own victimhood as a child, I waited 2 years for my own opportunity to seek justice in the Crown Court. That's years of your heart racing whenever you get a phone call from an unknown number. Is it the court? Is it the CPS? Years of anxiety that your perpetrator will retaliate. Years of your life excruciatingly on hold. But many victims today are being forced to sit with all of this for far longer than I did. And so Liberal Democrats and myself personally welcome the Justice Secretary's announcement today. But we all know that a huge backlog will still remain, which means victims and survivors will continue to be let down. And at a time when victims and survivors need more support during these agonising waits, government funding cuts and the NICS increases are putting services like Safeline and victim support at risk. So will the Lord Chancellor outline year by year her targets for reducing this backlog, and will she increase, not cut, support for charities to ensure that victims and survivors get the support that they need and deserve?
Secretary of State.
Can I thank the member, the honourable gentleman, for his remarks and pay tribute to the bravery that he has shown in his own personal life as he has sought justice for the crimes committed against him. His journey reflects that of many people, too many people across our country. I have my own constituency experience of the people I represent directly whose cases are trapped in the Crown Court backlog, so I hear regularly of the impact that it is having, and I'm very alive to the human cost of that Crown Court's backlog. That is why, at every available opportunity, I have sought to make progress in increasing funding and allocation in year and also this record settlement for the next year. But of course, I know we need to go further. I know we need to do more. That is why the work of Sir Brian Leveson is so crucial, because we know that without reform, no matter how much you sit to in the Crown Court, that backlog is still going to rise. And I hope that when that review reports, I can count on support for that reform from across this House. All that want to see the Crown Court backlog come down will want to do so, I hope. I would just say to him on victims funding, we have protected funding for victims of rape and serious sexual offences as well as domestic abuse. That funding is ring-fenced, and we will shortly be setting out our victims bill, which will have further measures in it to strengthen the victims code. And he asks about targets and timelines, and forgive me, this was also a point raised by the Shadow Justice Secretary. I have committed to once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts. Once the review that Sir Brian Leveson is conducting has reported and the government has made decisions on the recommendations it will take forward and has got ready legislation, we will be able to set out the impact of future legislation in terms of bringing down that Crown Courts backlog.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely flabbergasted with some of the things that the Shadow Minister has said today. And I can assure him that this backlog has not just materialised over the last 8 months. I can say that as a Crown prosecutor that worked throughout the last 14 years under this last government, where we saw the waiting lists go up and up and up, despite the best efforts of the hard-working staff throughout the criminal justice service. So can the Lord Chancellor today confirm that the measures that she has announced today will finally allow victims, including those in my constituency of Amber Valley, to have some confidence that there's finally a government that is going to tackle this issue?
Thank my honourable friend for her question. Flabbergasted is one way of describing it. It's probably the only one that would be found in order for Mr. Speaker, so I shall refrain from using other language. She is a former prosecutor herself. She knows of what she speaks, and I pay tribute to the work that she did in her previous profession. I think the message should go out loud and clear to her constituents and people up and down this country. This government is acting to deal with the Crown Court's backlog. We have a plan, we've increased funding, and we're considering the reform that is needed that's been ducked by too many others to get this system sorted out once and for all.
Sir Julian.
Mr. Speaker, I refer the House to my register of voluntary interests. I welcome the statement. Would she agree that one way of getting cash into the criminal system is to reduce the cost of the civil system? And could I urge her to continue to look at methods of alternative dispute resolution and particularly mediation within the civil system?
I thank him for his comments. He's absolutely right. All mechanisms at our disposal to reduce the cost of people going to court should be on the table. We've already been acting to try and amplify the availability of mediation and other ways in which issues can be resolved. Going to court is always very expensive, sometimes for the individuals involved, often for the taxpayer, and it's important that we keep bearing down on those costs.
Warinder, Juss.
First of all, please thank the Lord Chancellor for her honesty in laying out clearly the difficult situation that we have inherited from the party opposite. And I welcome the measures that she has proposed, the record investment in the justice system, and the measures taken to reduce the number of cases that will be going into the Crown Court. And it has got worse because of the party opposite. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that in addition to the measures that she has already proposed, that we should continue focusing on reducing crime in the first place, such as pursuing our policies of tackling youth crime, knife crime and tackling violence against women and girls?
Yeah. Well, my honourable friend is right that in order to deal with all of the problems within the criminal justice system, whether that's in policing, with prosecutors, with the situation in the Crown Courts, we need a system-wide approach, and that does mean taking action on the sorts of crimes that affect neighbourhoods up and down the country. That's why the Home Secretary's recent Crime and Policing Bill will be such a landmark piece of legislation. We all have to play our part because the criminal justice system has been left in a truly terrible state by the previous administration, and this government is getting on with the job of sorting it out.
Sir Christopher Chope.
This announcement is small beer, isn't it? The £92 million extra offered for criminal legal aid is exceeded 20-fold by the subsidies given to offshore wind, which is £1.9 billion last year alone. Why is it that the government has such perverse priorities? And when are we going to put the criminal justice system above the interests of offshore wind operators?
We're talking about the highest ever funded allocation in the Crown Courts at 110,000 Crown Court sitting days. That is a record. He says small beer. I wonder if he's been imbibing something before getting on his feet.
Pam Cox.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the Lord Chancellor's announcement of additional sitting days. The Justice Select Committee has been looking into the court backlog issue, and we've also been hearing about the ongoing need for digitisation of court and wider criminal justice processes. We need to replace a creaking paper-based system which is contributing to those delays. So will the Lord Chancellor continue to support drives to successfully digitise these processes? And would she also join with me in congratulating the party opposite for marking International Women's Day with such style?
She's absolutely right on the point on digitisation and efficiency. I've already funded, after the first phase of the spending review ongoing work to improve digitisation within all of our courts processes. She's right, we absolutely need to move away from such paper-based and paper-heavy systems that we have at the moment. Part 2 of Brian Levison's work, which will report in autumn, will be looking at cross-system efficiency as well. She's absolutely right. We do need to increase productivity and efficiency because that is the final piece of the puzzle if we're going to sort out the backlog.
Okay. Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the extra sitting days? And I also welcome the announcements about reform, but I hope the right to trial by jury, the ancient right that we have in this country, will remain. But can I ask the Lord Chancellor particularly to look at Somerset's Crown Court in Taunton? It was closed in 2023, after work began in 2022, when items were falling on the heads of the court from the ceiling. We've just been told another whole year it will be closed. And whilst that is closed for another 12 months, victims of crime will have to travel tens and tens of miles further. We have even court users sleeping under a bush because they can't travel back and forth. We need to get our Crown Court open. Will she please look at expediting those works to get our Crown Court open again?
I thank the Honourable Member for his question. I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with the Courts Minister to talk about the situation in Taunton.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm slightly worried about the party opposite, who appear to be the arsonists, who are now complaining that the fire brigade is turning up too late to put out the fire, when they were the one that set it in the first place. And I do worry that they don't understand the magnitude of the challenge and scale that they left behind, because I've heard it from people in my own constituency who have been waiting years to have a court case, which is getting worse. But the honourable gentleman should take. If the honourable gentleman would spend more time providing leadership rather than auditioning for it, he would own up to his own failures in this House, and he would say how much the Conservatives left this country in a mess. But what I wanted to ask the Secretary of State is, courts aren't run just by judges. There is a lot of support staff in courts who make the court system run. So can she tell me what conversations she's had across government to make sure that those staff are also available, to make sure that as many courts are available as possible?
I think the Shadow Lord Chancellor is having such fun with his audition for leadership. It would be a shame to seek to deprive him of it. My honourable friend says they don't understand the party opposite, the mess they've left behind. I wonder, instead of they don't understand, they simply don't want to, because a party that was willing to reckon with the mistakes that they made in office would at least have started with some humility and perhaps an apology for the mess that they left behind. And he's right to point out that we're talking about a whole system approach. One of the reasons why the situation with the backlog is scheduled to get worse, no matter how many Crown Court sitting days you have, is because you've got an influx of cases into the system. That's actually a good thing because it means that the police are doing their job, prosecutions are being brought, but the rate of demand coming into the system is far outstripping, even at maximum capacity, the disposal of those cases. The case mix is more complex. It needs a system-wide response. That's what this government is providing.
Gavin Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When does the Lord Chancellor expect the additional places as being provided to start bearing down on the remand population?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right to refer to the issues with the remand population. To deal with the issues with the remand population, which is growing, it's currently at 17,000, has a big impact on prison capacity. That's why I increased magistrates' court sentencing powers a few months ago. It's why I've increased Crown Court sitting days, and it's why we've got the record allocation next year. The demand coming into the system is one of the reasons why bearing down on remand has been particularly challenging, but it's something that we continue to work with the judiciary on. Listings are, of course, a matter for the independent judiciary.
Mr.
Speaker, I would have expected a little bit more humility from the benches opposite. They left a legacy of chaos in our prisons, huge court backlog, and what we're dealing with here fundamentally is the backlog that they left behind. And the Minister has set out a process for dealing with the growing backlog, but it's ultimately lays at the door of the Conservative Party, who left the place in chaos. So does my right honourable friend think, shouldn't we be hearing an apology from the people opposite, rather than claiming some...
Sorry does seem to be the hardest word for the party opposite. I have long since stopped waiting for that apology. All I would observe, and I say this with 14 years of opposition experience under my belt, parties that don't acknowledge their own mistakes and sort themselves out rarely get elected.
Gavin Robbins.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and in welcoming the statement, can I say that it would reserve judgment on whether we need an additional court, an intermediary court, particularly if that's going to be resourced from the existing magistrates and Crown Court system. But can I ask the Lord Chancellor, particularly following on the question from Stratford, if we have a backlog in England, we have a backlog in Northern Ireland, and people are on remand for too long, increasingly people are being released following conviction with time served, and there's no opportunity for rehabilitation whatsoever. Will the opportunity to rehabilitate offenders whilst on remand form part of the Brian Levison review?
Well, look, he's absolutely right to raise the issues relating to remand. We do have a problem with the remand population. It's why I've already been making the changes that I've highlighted, and it's why the work of both reviews, the one being conducted by Sir Brian Levison, looking at once-in-a-generation court reform, and also by David Gorkin, the independent panel, looking at sentencing, is so crucial, because it is essential that not only do we bear down on the Crown Court backlog, but that we also get our prison capacity back into balance and have a sustainable prison system in this country.
Mr. Speaker, criminal justice was an easy target for Tory austerity cuts, and it always impacts the people with the smallest voice. Rape victims in Truro and Farnsworth have come to me with waits of years for their cases to be heard and having hearings cancelled at the last minute. So I very much welcome this investment. I would ask for more detail on the case for a new court to sit between the magistrates and the Crown and how that may work.
On the possibility of a court that sits between the magistrates and the Crown, that's something that Sir Brian is considering, and she'll understand why I would want to wait until he has made his recommendations. But it's one of a range of options of different ways in which we could change policy in order to bear down in the long term on that Crown Court's backlog, and we will consider his recommendations and bring forward legislation for those that we want to take forward in the spring. And let me just say, look, I absolutely hear what she's saying about the terrible experience of victims who have their cases cancelled on the day, and the impact on rape victims in particular. It's one of the reasons why we've already gone ahead and fulfilled our manifesto commitment of having independent legal advisors for victims of rape, so that their specific rights in law are always protected.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lord Chancellor has been in office for 8 months today, and whilst her announcement of additional sitting days is welcome, it is regrettable she didn't make this statement 7 months ago. There is only so long that she can blame the last government for the Crown Court backlog. We all know that the pandemic was largely responsible for the very substantial increase. We know that the Lady Chief Justice has offered the Lord Chancellor a further 2,500 sitting days. Would she say why she's not taking advantage of that? There are currently too many people on remand for too long. And it's clear that even the announcement she's made today will not lead to a reduction in the backlog. So we need a structural change. So will the Lord Chancellor give serious consideration to the creation of an intermediate court, so that we can reduce this backlog more quickly?
I would just gently remind him that the Concordat process that I have concluded with the announcements today is earlier than the one that I inherited from his party. So we have been cracking on. I've been getting on with the job. I increased sitting days immediately. I've taken every opportunity to increase sitting days further, and I've now made a record allocation. He says that the Lady Chief Justice has offered more sitting days. He'll know, of course, the Lady Chief Justice isn't able to offer sitting days. What she's able to comment on is maximum judicial capacity, which she has done so as is appropriate, in order to make sure that those sitting days are capable of being sat in the Crown Court. I have to consider the wider system capacity issues. That is about the availability of legal aid, it's about prosecutors, it's about defence barristers as well. That is why at the unprecedented record level of 110,000 Crown Court sitting days, I can say the system overall, not just judicial capacity, but the overall system has the capacity to meet these days.
It's been correct.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Public Accounts Committee published a report in which said the Razzo case, that's the rape and serious sexual offences, were taking so many years to come to trial. When I was a Shadow Justice Minister for a number of years, at that dispatch box, I was asking the previous government day in, day out, as to what they were doing to try to reduce the court delays. 14 years, they did nothing. Now, this Lord Chancellor, in 8 months, has provided 110,000 court sitting days. So, would the Lord Chancellor agree with me that the expression that comes to mind is the case of the pot calling the kettle black?
I can tell my honourable friend that many expressions have come to mind as I've been listening. Some of the drivel from some of the members opposite, not all of which will not fall foul of Erskine May, so I will keep my counsel on that. She does refer to the Public Accounts Committee report, and I will just gently observe, I was a long-term member of that committee myself. I have the highest regard for the Public Accounts Committee, but I do reject the criticism they have made, because this is a government that clearly has a plan, not just on funding and resources for the Crown Court, but also on the reform that will ultimately be needed to get the system into balance.
Wild.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite this announcement, the backlog will increase, but when cases do go to court, it's important that offenders serve the sentence they're given. So following the Lord Chancellor's trip to Texas, where some prisoners serve as little as 25% of their sentence, will she rule out adopting such a soft sentencing policy?
Well, what I would say to him is that the experience of the Texans, who had similar problems to what we face today, but they had theirs 20 years or so ago, is that the system of good behaviour credits, which incentivises offenders to engage in rehabilitation activity, to get help for their drug addictions or their alcohol problems, mental health issues and so on, if they engage with that and get their good behaviour credits, that is how they earn their way to an earlier parole hearing. It isn't... It is the definition of a tough system because it says to offenders, you have to do something good in order to earn the possibility of an earlier release. It is a system that is well worth learning from because their reoffending rates are very low compared to ours. One of the prisons I visited in Texas has a reoffending rate of 17%. I would dream of that number for us here in this country because every time we bear down on reoffending, that is cutting crime and it's a strategy for making sure we have fewer victims in the future. I would hope that whatever proposals we bring forward, if they lead to a reduction in reoffending, those are proposals that he would back.
Mr Speaker, in June 2024, in the dying days of the last Conservative government and after 14 years of their rule, there emerged a shocking statistic. 60% of rape victims were withdrawing from the court process, mainly because of court delays. Isn't that a damning indictment on any government that has taken power in this country? And what is she doing as a result of today's announcement that will help reduce that awful decision taken by so many rape victims?
He's absolutely right. The figures that he notes are a damning indictment of the legacy of the last Conservative government. The announcement we've made today will bear down on that court's backlog, and it will mean some rape victims get their cases heard as cases move through the system more swiftly. It's also why we've already implemented our manifesto commitment on independent legal advisors, because we know that in addition to delays, one of the things that causes many rape victims to drop out is inappropriate requests for personal information that go beyond what the law requires. And so those independent legal advisors will ensure that the rights in law of rape victims are respected and that the process does not feel like it is re-traumatising women who are already going through so much and who are waiting for their day in court to have justice done.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Harrow Crown Court has got 8 courtrooms and could help alleviate the capacity problems. Sadly, it's been closed since 2023 as a result of finding rack in the roof. It was supposed to open last year. It was then extended to April 2025 this year. It's now being said it won't open for a further year. So could the Justice Secretary then have a look at, with this improved funding, see if we can speed up the process of bringing back that court back into action and help the people who are now having to go to Willesden, Amersham, Southwark and all over London for their cases to be heard so they can get justice at a local level.
I absolutely understand his frustration and that of his constituents. I understand the problems at Harrow relate to RAC and the delays are due to contractor issues. I will make sure that we write to him with a full plan of what we anticipate will happen to get the Crown Court back into use. I hope he will recognise that we have a record investment also being announced today on Crown Court maintenance. It is up by £28.5 million and that will go some way to alleviating some of these maintenance issues.
Sean Davis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under the last Conservative government, we saw reductions in Crown Court judges in Shropshire and Telford. We saw courtrooms empty for years while victims waited for years for their trials to take place. And now with Labour, we've got an extra Crown Court judge, a remand court back in the county, and extra Crown Court sitting times. I've heard from magistrates and Crown Court judges in my area that defendants are opting for Crown Court trials because they know it will take years to conclude. Can we make sure that does not happen in future? And Mr Speaker, just in regards to the backlog, we should absolutely tackle the backlog. But can the Lord Chancellor give an assurance that we will not, unlike the last government, tell police officers to stop arresting people and put them before the courts?
I can absolutely give him that reassurance. This is the government that will deliver 13,000 extra neighbourhood police officers because we're absolutely clear that we need neighbourhood policing and bobbies back on the beat in this country. He's right to note that the size of the backlog and the structural problem with that backlog means that many defendants are gaming the system. And they know that they can take their chances, wait it out, and hope that either the victim gives up or for some other reason the case just simply never gets to court. That is why, in addition to the record funding, we have to consider once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the Lord Chancellor accept that part of the reason for a loss of public confidence are the sort of cases which are clogging up tribunal and court time, as are explained in his column in the Times today by Jawad Iqbal, involving dubious decisions about not being able to deport convicted criminals, such as an Iraqi cocaine dealer who can't be sent back to his homeland because he's considered to be too westernized. Quite apart from the perversity of the result, is it not an insult to genuine victims of crimes who are held up getting the judgments that they deserve?
Well, he'll know that I'm not going to. It'd be inappropriate for the Lord Chancellor to comment on individual judgments. But actually, in relation to some of the decisions in the immigration chamber, which have been the subject of some public discussion, he will know that the Prime Minister has been very clear that where there is a policy or a legal change that is required, it is for the government to bring forward those changes and for this House to ultimately vote on them. And in respect of that, the Home Secretary is considering further changes to the law. He mentioned deportations. Let me just remind him that under this government, deportations of foreign national offenders out of our prisons are up by 23%.
President.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And like Chorley, Harlow Magistrates Court sadly closed in 2019. Can I thank the Lord Chancellor for her statement today? But would she agree with me that we need radical reforms to start driving down the Crown Court backlog, including the use of magistrate courts? As I say, sadly, we can't use Harlow at the moment, and so that we can get through cases quicker and give victims the justice they deserve.
I'm very much listening carefully and taking under advisement all of these lobbying requests, including from the Speaker himself about courts in their own areas. I thank both the Speaker and the Honourable Gentleman for that. He's absolutely right. We do need radical reform. Without radical reform, that backlog, no matter how much you fund in terms of Crown Court sitting days, is going to keep going up and up. And that is why Sir Brian Levison's work is so very crucial.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I speak as a member of the Public Accounts Committee that worked on the report Justice Delayed is Justice Denied, and I would recommend members peruse it. And it's on that point that I would ask the Lord Chancellor what specific conversations she's had with colleagues in the MHCLG about speeding up the planning process so that we can get more courtrooms operating.
We are speeding up the planning process.
Well, we are speeding up the planning process. The Courts Minister is in regular conversation with the Planning Minister. The issue in relation to Crown Court capacity, though, specifically, is less one of planning and more of, A, having enough days funded so that maximum use can be made of every available courtroom, but also recognising that there has to be some level of give in the system in terms of courtroom usage in order to enable the system to be run efficiently, because demand ebbs and flows at every court across the whole of the country, and so some spare capacity needs to be maintained. It is that spare capacity that enabled such a swift response to the summer riot. So I hope he will reflect on the fact that partly some usage is always going to be required, but in respect of the individual conversations, those are happening regularly between the Courts Minister and the Planning Minister.
Well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Lord Chancellor for her statement and the record funding. It's just a shame that the Shadow Justice Secretary, bereft of any policy ideas, has turned up today to basically tackle the man, in this case the woman, rather than play the ball. And I think a little bit of humility, contrition and a wholesome apology wouldn't go amiss. Does the Lord Chancellor agree that in allowing the backlog to spiral out of control, the previous government failed countless victims? And can she confirm that today's announcement means victims can have more confidence in justice system under Labour?
Well, let me just observe, I'm very happy to fight the Shadow Lord Chancellor, woman to man, anytime he likes. On the failure of the previous administration, I do think that members opposite should own up to that failure and apologise for it if they want to get a hearing from anybody in politics or indeed people in the country ever again. But what this government has shown is we are determined to clean up the mess that we inherited, and what victims across the country can take confidence in is that we have made record funding available and we are considering the structural reform that is required to sort this system out.
Matt Martin.
Speaker. When I speak with the police in Tunbridge Wells, they often comment that a large court backlog has a real effect on levels of crime. There are more criminals in circulation, and frankly, the system is seen as a bit of a soft touch if cases are never brought to court. Can I ask the Justice Secretary very simply, what is the backlog in Kent, and when will it be cleared? And if she doesn't have the figures to hand, would she be able to write to me with them?
Well, yeah, I'm very happy to write to him with the specific figures for Kent, but he will know the criminal justice system as a whole is under tremendous pressure and under extreme stress. That is because of the backlog. It's also because of the prisons' capacity crisis, all the legacy of the previous government, which we are now fixing.
Dave Robertson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is no surprise to me that I am the third MP from Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent that's taken part today, because in Staffordshire we now have 1,350 open cases waiting to be heard by Crown Courts. That has more than doubled over the last 5 years of Conservative mismanagement and is the highest highest number since records began. I actually spoke to the police commander in Lichfield on Monday this week. One of his major concerns is that delays in justice being seen in courts is making his job harder in building the relationships that he needs to with our community. In the worst cases that he raised with me, there are cases of serious sexual assault and rape that are almost 5 years delayed. Can I ask the Secretary of State, what steps she will be taking to make sure that these additional extra sitting days are targeted at the most serious offenders?
Well, he raises a very important point. It's my job as Lord Chancellor to make sure that the overall settlement for Crown Court sitting days is sufficiently big in order to help drive down that Crown Court backlog, and that is why I've made the record allocation today. Listing specifically of individual cases, though, are of course a matter for the independent judiciary. It would be improper and inappropriate for me to comment on those listings decisions, but taken as a whole, in terms of both the investment that we're making and the reform that we are considering once the review of Sir Brian Leveson has reported, I think that he can take confidence in, his constituents can take confidence that this is a government that's going to sort this system out.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank very much the Lord Chancellor for increasing the sitting days to attempt to tackle the extremely large delays in court cases that we in the United Kingdom face, which is a sad reality for those seeking justice. The Lord Chancellor will know in Northern Ireland there are currently 18,907 pending cases in magistrates' courts, which is absolutely huge. So, given that the drastic increase in cases regarding violence against women and girls in Northern Ireland, can I very gently ask the Lord Chancellor what discussion the Honourable Lady has had with the Policing and Justice Minister to help reduce and address court cases and their delays in the province? Thanks so much.
It's always a pleasure to respond to the honourable gentleman. I thank him for his remarks welcoming the announcement today. The Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State will be meeting with devolved Justice Ministers very soon, and we will update him on the work that we are doing with ministers in Northern Ireland.
Julia Buckley. Madam Deputy Speaker, and could I associate myself with the remarks of my honourable friend and neighbour, also from Shropshire, in welcoming today's much-needed funding announcement, and particularly those structural reforms to increase capacity. In my constituency of Shrewsbury, we currently have no working magistrates' court, despite being the county town for 350,000 residents. So will these reforms also enable and support the very pragmatic question of reallocating courtrooms between Crown and magistrates' use for areas like us in Shropshire? So when we're unlocking that spare capacity, it's quite specifically in towns like Shrewsbury that are better served by public transport for all of our rural population.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. The principle of local justice is incredibly important to this government, and we will endeavour to make sure that that is at the heart of all of our proposals and changes that we will make in the future. And we've also increased recruitment into the magistracy as well.
Lawrence Turner.
Deputy Speaker, and I welcome today's announcement. Recruitment and retention challenges have limited access to justice in recent years. So can the Lord Chancellor outline what steps she is taking to ensure that we have enough barristers and solicitors so that the courts get through as many cases as possible?
He's absolutely right to raise the question on availability of lawyers. That's why this government has already increased criminal legal aid by up to £92 million, and it's why we've increased the number of prosecutors as well, and we'll be bringing forward more changes in the upcoming Victims Bill to increase the availability of certain types of lawyers to do prosecution work.
Nessel Chalisken.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for her Secretary of State for her statement. As a member of the Public Accounts Committee, I've recently heard details of the shocking state of disrepair in recent years of our courts. And the most recent report identified the Nightingale courts that were set up under the previous government as a way to deal with the backlog of COVID. Many years on, those Nightingale courts, some of which still exist, and in some cases are costing 6 times more than a normal court. Can the Secretary of State give us reassurance that they will continue to close and that we can direct that money into the very courts that need the repairs?
My honourable friend raises an important point. We're keeping the situation in relation to Nightingale courts under review, where they're making a contribution that is assisting with case flow through the system. I think there is a case for keeping them, but it is something that is under review, and the Courts Minister will be happy to write to her with further details.
Jake Richards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've only been in this House for a few months, but I must admit I'm absolutely staggered by the chutzpah of the party opposite in their attitude to this issue. Most of them have left, but when they were here, their attitude to this issue. In a competitive field, the state of our criminal courts and our criminal justice system perhaps wins the award for the most acute crisis that is the result of the legacy of the last government. I really welcome the statement today, in particular the emphasis not just on capacity but productivity. Can I just push the government as to whether that approach will be taken also in our family courts? I welcome the investment into infrastructure and capital spend in family courts, but also we need to look at how we can improve productivity there too.
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point on productivity, and it's why the second phase of Sir Brian Levison's work is so crucial. He'll know that we have expanded our Pathfinder pilot, which is a really important, and we think it's making a really important contribution to the flow of cases through the family court, and it's something that we're keeping under review.
That concludes the state.